of Engineering, Agartala, welcoming you all technical station, third international workshop on advanced seismology, seismic hazard, and earthquake engineering, ASSHEE 2021. Now I request Professor Surendranath Somala, sir, to deliver his lecture on bridges subjected to scenario earthquake. Sir's field of interest are seismic isolation and anti-seismic devices, seismic resilience, induced microseismicity, structural health monitoring. Sir is currently Associate Professor from Department of Civil Engineering, IIT Hyderabad. I also request Professor Dr. Apu Kumar Shaha, Associate Professor, for chairing the session. Sir, please.
Thank you.
Now I request Dr. Surendranath Somalia, sir, to deliver his lecture. Sir, please.
Yeah, can you see my screen in full screen mode?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome everyone. Today I'm going to talk about bridges subjected to scenario earthquakes. Welcome to this ASSHEE 2021. Thanks to the Techno Engineering College for organizing this, Professor Kayal for leading it, and of course I've attended the first one in person at Agartala, but now we are doing this in the online mode. So this is the third version of this workshop, and I'm a faculty at IIT Hyderabad. This is Surendranath Somala. So when I say scenario earthquakes, what do I really mean by it? Even before going to scenario earthquakes, what does earthquake mean to you? So for many people, when we say earthquake is definitely a magnitude. That much, pretty much everybody knows. Certain magnitude on Richter scale. People largely talk about Richter scale. Richter scale is mostly a different magnitude. We are talking about moment magnitude. Most media also make this a small issue. But Hiro Kanamori, who is also at Caltech, who invented moment magnitude, he never tried to name it after himself. But for earthquake, one parameter that pretty much everybody knows, including even media, is of course the magnitude. Then if you ask a little bit more detail about earthquake, people may start saying about focal mechanism. This has so much strike or dip or rake and so on. But when I say scenario, I'm really talking about not the point source, but the finite fault earthquakes. So the finite fault earthquakes are described by not one point, but rectangle typically. Of course, very early on, people have started with circular ruptures for simplicity, of course, for analytical solutions. Later, they did realize that slabs have a certain thickness. There is a seismogenic depth below which you can't see the rupture. It's creeping. It's a different mechanism altogether. Earthquakes actually occur mostly, largely at least in the shallow tectonic regions, in the shallow region. And once you have a rupture of certain length, earthquake propagates over a long aspect ratio of faults where length is obviously larger than the depth. And once that is what we call rupture. Rupture is the propagation on such a rectangle. And this is, you're looking at underground. It's not the map view. Most engineers are used to look at the map view. On the map, you see the peak ground acceleration, things like that. What you're seeing here is something else. It's the scenario rupture. What you're seeing is a slip distribution. The colors here, they represent slip distribution. So scenario ruptures, largely, there are two different ways of simulating these ruptures, unlike points. One is, of course, kinematic way, and other is dynamic. So in the kinematic way, which is more popular and known to others, well benchmarked and widely accepted, but it has its own limitations, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. It has broadly three parameters. One is, of course, rupture velocity or rupture time. The contours that you see here on black color line, so here 10 is marked on this contour. This is one of the slip maps for some earthquake inverted by Tectonics Caltech. These are the rupture time contours. Then rise time, of course, is not clearly evident here, but the remaining colors that you see below are the slip distribution. Slip distribution also has an angle associated with it because it has two components, along the strike component and along the dip component, and the arrows, white color arrows that you see are the resultant of the two components. So that's how one would describe a kinematic way of a rupture, scenario rupture. But it has its own limitations. You're directly starting off with the forcing function and trying to simulate waves inside a medium. It could be layered medium, homogeneous medium, or a 3D medium. Waves are propagated and their recordings are gathered, attained on the surface of the Earth. That's where we have engineering structures, buildings, bridges, dams, whatnot, or even underground for that matter. You have also substructures. So this is kind of the forcing function you may think of. And due to this, we are trying to compute the response on the top of the surface of the ground. That much is the engineering seismology part of it. But beyond that, engineers are interested in using that sort of time histories to come to study the structural response. Now, this kinematic way of approach has its own limitations. People can come up with any numbers. By the way, this red colored star here is the hypocenter. That's where the earthquake would start. So I can put in any slip distribution and with any of these parameters, doesn't matter whether it's physics based or not, you still get some shaking on the ground. But there is misconception. There are in scenario ruptures, so in the terminology that you see in literature, where whenever there's used physics-based ruptures, they do mean both kinematic as well as dynamic together. But the real things that have physics in it are the dynamic variants of scenarios, where you start off from the stresses itself. Everybody knows and understands, even geotechnical engineering, but this is like rock mechanics kind of stresses we are talking about. The normal and shear stresses. If anybody who knows simple more Coulomb friction, you know that there is normal stress acting, and then the shear stress would be friction coefficient times the normal stress. But that friction coefficient is not simple. It does something that evolves with, it can weaken with respect to slip. As slip increases, it can weaken, or as the rate at which the sliding happens, this can weaken. The friction coefficient can be lowered. So that is the contact friction law. And the state evolution, there can be extra state variables. The fault here is modeled as very smooth version, but there can be undulations or asperities on top of the fault. And those, as per, how does the state variable and things like that, they would evolve. And especially if you're talking about thermal weakening and so on, you can even have other evolution laws for that. So dynamic is more fundamental. It comes from rupture mechanics and the contact friction law. So what you see here is a mixed mode rupture. It is mode 2 in the direction of the strike and mode 3 away from the direction of the strike. That's why you see these ears or lobes that are developing. The rupture is actually faster in the direction of strike. That's why in some cases, especially, this is a super shear rupture, similar to supersonic waves that you see in aerospace or other in air, other medium. So the super shear actually travels at faster than the shear wave speed of the medium. And so, whereas it would still remain sub shear in the mode 3 fracture mechanics does not permit super shear, but in the mode 2, you can actually see there are 3 modes. Of course, the first mode is the tensile or the opening, which we are not talking about dike intrusions, and those people are interested in mode 1. But earthquake ruptures are mixed mode ruptures with mode 2 and mode 3. Mode 2 is along the direction in which you are applying the shear stress or the shear traction. The earthquake in this case has started off somewhere here by artificially perturbing the stress slightly above the value at which this would start. The earthquake would go beyond this law. So that's how we have the kinematic and dynamic, but dynamic is rarely used. We have started using, and we have even found some engineering applications. We have shown it. But whenever people are talking about scenario ruptures, one has to understand that they are kinematic in nature. They are slightly more advanced than the point source description of an earthquake, which has only focal mechanism. It starts off with a rectangle, and the rectangle is subdivided into a lot of sub-rectangles called the subfaults, and each subfault can be thought of roughly as a point source of smaller magnitude. So, yeah, kinematic is what most people are talking about when you see literature in terms of what is a scenario rupture. And now, this kinematic rupture description can also be prescribed in a linear manner or a non-linear manner. Of course, this is more from the inversion perspective that I'm talking about, but the same thing is applicable when you're talking about just the 3 parameters that I said in the previous slide, rupture, velocity, rise time, and slip. So they are marked here clearly for you. So if this is how the contours of rupture time are for an earthquake that starts off at the star, but then at any particular grid point that you're interested in, it has certain amplitude to it. Rupture time, that is the onset time at which the rupture would reach that point with reference to this origin time of the earthquake from the hypocenter. And rise time is for how long your rupture is actually happening. How long does it take for the rupture to go past that point? Beyond that point, there's no more movement or relative motion on the fault. So the 3 simple parameters can be described in that manner. And then the overall shape, also, there are lots of different shapes. The simplest is, of course, half cosine. Costroke crack has more implications for a dynamic way of looking at it. UFA is, some people have found that it can capture, if you have certain values on how do you prescribe the UFA function, it does capture a lot of source physics without really having to go into the dynamics. You can give the kinematic description and get away with it. The linear way of formulating it, the scenario rupture description is, here you're seeing circular contours. What are these circular contours? For an earthquake that started off somewhere here on the fault plane, which is underground, the rupture has propagated at constant speed. And so that's why you have circular contours. So the rupture velocity is actually constant. And well, in a linear sense, you would be these dotted triangles, they are the basis functions, and they also have certain amplitude, just like here. But the rise time of each individual triangle is fixed, but you can have multiple such triangles, numerous triangles, those functions, and all of those combined would give you the overall rise time for that particular point, subfault point on the fault. So these are ways of describing scenario ruptures. Now, once you describe the scenario rupture, you want to compute ground shaking. And ground shaking is required within the frequencies of interest to engineers. What do you mean by frequencies of interest to engineers? The structures, each building, each structure has certain fundamental frequency and also higher modes. So the fundamental frequency, if the earthquake or the shaking has large amount of energy in the fundamental frequency of the structure, resonance can happen, and you can see lots of deformation or damage, high vibration, basically. So in order to mitigate that, a lot of vibration mitigation measures are also typically proposed. But the frequency band at which engineers are really interested in is at least 0 to 10. But in this case, I think they're going for 0 to 20. What I'm going to show here are Californian ruptures to begin with. And if we have time, I'll go into other scenario ruptures. But all of this is computed. Why is it broadband? It's a combination of low frequency and high frequency content. The low frequency simulations in the rupture simulations perspective, when they call low frequency, they're really referring to 0 to 1 hertz. Of course, in global seismology, this is a broader audience, so people may feel that this is a different number from what they know or understand from the word low frequency, but this is from the engineering perspective or earthquake simulation perspective for the purpose of time histories to do structural analysis. When what we call low frequency is 0 to 0.5 or 0 to 1 hertz, there we know the velocity model in sufficient detail, and so we can resolve the features that we know or want or really interested in. That is a 3D deterministic 3D simulations of earthquakes using kinematic ruptures. And high frequency is typically due to the roughness of the fault or undulations, asperities, and so on. There can be also richness in the high frequency content, and that is typically simulated stochastically. And only when you add them both or combine them in frequency domain, you get the broadband ground motion. And one such tool that is made available by the Southern California Earthquake Center is the broadband platform. BBP here stands for the broadband platform. It has been evolving. Of course, I think one of the latest versions, maybe 17 or 18. Earlier versions were 14, 15. The nomenclature may change, but this is one of such tools that can combine the low frequency content with the high frequency content. Either you give the Green's functions or you give the low frequency synthetics and ask it to combine with the high frequency synthetics and so on. So today, when I talk about scenario ruptures, I'm largely going to concentrate on California, as I said. And California has two important metropolitan centers. One is Los Angeles, of course, that's in Southern California, and the other is San Francisco in Northern California. And the well-known fault can host a large magnitude earthquake is the San Andreas fault. San Andreas fault has a potential to host the southern post segment, particularly has a potential to host up to magnitude 7.9. That is based on the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast version 2. Of course, nowadays, recently version 3 has also been released for use of. So this is the kind of magnitude that is expected. As I said, whenever we talk about earthquake, this is one number that you know of. But earthquake is not just one number. It is a rupture that propagates on the fault. This black line that you see here is the fault, the San Andreas fault in Southern California. This is actually the surface trace, and these stars are various hypocenters. So whenever we do scenario ruptures, we can't just get away with just one scenario, because that may not necessarily be the event that would be happening. The earthquake may start here or here or here. We don't know a priori. So engineers, they're not happy with just one scenario. So all possibilities are to be simulated, and structural analysis has to be carried out, and the variability has to be quantified, and that's how you derive the fragility curves. So they have 7 such scenarios for the southern segment of the San Andreas. It's a very long one. As you can see from these degrees, each degree, if you translate to roughly 110 kilometers, we're talking about more than 200 in this direction, and also a couple of hundreds in this direction. These are the stations, the red circles are the stations at which the earthquake data is simulated. Now, San Andreas is well known even for people sitting in India or far away from California, but there are also other faults that have potential to host large magnitude earthquakes. One such thing is the San Jacinto fault. That can also host almost up to magnitude 7.9 according to the user forecast. So on this also some 4 stars, you can see here 4 scenarios have been simulated by the SCEC group. I'm going to mostly use the existing ground motion simulations that they have made available on the Design Safe portal, because for us to come up with both the earthquake rupture as well as the structural analysis, that is, of course, the end-to-end, that's the fullest thing that you can do, from rupture all the way to collapse of the structural simulation. But if for those who want to mitigate, not get into the rupture part, the ruptures have been well calibrated by the SCEC group. So, these have been simulated, these red dots, for various hypocenters. And so there's one more for Southern California, that is the Elysian Park. Elysian Park earthquake, it can host only 6.6. You may feel 6.6, what is it going to cause? But the point is, it's so close to LA. Pasadena is somewhere over here, Caltech. Los Angeles is somewhere over here. So this also has enough being in close proximity, and this particular thing is roughly at this position here in this figure. So although it may be far off from this, there is a fault that is locally located that can cause sufficient damage to structures in Los Angeles. In this case, I'm of course focusing mostly on the bridges. And in the Northern California also, the San Andreas fault is so long, it extends all the way from Southern California, even into the Northern California. This is the northern Californian segment of the San Andreas, and it has a potential to host magnitude 8 earthquake. So 8 magnitude earthquake is possible. And once again, this on this segment, multiple hypocenters have been marked. So multiple rupture scenarios have been simulated. And these dots here are the stations at which they correspond to the San Francisco stations. And this region that you see here, that is roughly here in this figure. So the Hayward fault is actually smaller. It's located somewhere here, but it is in close proximity to all these stations. So although it's going to host only 7 magnitude earthquake, unlike northern San Andreas, which can host 8 magnitude earthquake, this is so close to the San Francisco city that it's also important to simulate multiple rupture scenarios on this for the same set of stations that have already been shown in this figure. Now, it is also important to note here that smaller magnitudes actually have lower recurrence intervals. So this the chance of this occurring very soon is more compared to this 8 magnitude on the northern San Andreas. So with these kind of scenario ruptures, lots of ground motion data, the time histories, acceleration records have been made available, and we directly use a bunch of them. The response spectrum that is of interest to engineers is plotted and shown. I haven't shown any of the time histories. I'm directly showing you the response spectra. And the sites are actually located on multiple site classes. As you go into higher site classes, the VS30 parameter decreases, so there can be large amplification. So you see this pink color here. That's more widely spread compared to, say, this yellow color, which is very tightly constrained within this regime, that's site class B. This is, of course, still not rocky, but has well over a few hundreds of meters per second, close to 1,000 maybe. Shear wave velocity. So this is roughly how the response spectra for all these simulations that were shown earlier looks like. For multiple earthquake scenarios on each fault indicated by the stars, and for multiple dots shown, these are the stations at which the recordings are taken. In some cases, there is the San Bernardino station, basin also here. There's LA basin, Los Angeles is also here. So I'm going to mostly focus on Los Angeles and San Francisco throughout this talk. So now comes the bridge part. The title, if you remember, it's scenario rupture subjected to the bridge. To start with, we've taken diaphragm abutment bridge. Bridges are broadly classified based on the abutment conditions into 2 types. One is a diaphragm abutment bridge, where you have a monolithic arrangement of the bridge deck with respect to the abutment. But there is also seat abutment, where some people try to call it even isolated bridges, where the bridge is isolated at the abutment, also at the pier, by some elastomeric isolators. Nowadays, even triple pendulum and other advanced isolators are coming into picture. So one such simple bridge model has been taken with 2 spans, one central column, and abutment. So broadly speaking, this has 3 components. One is, of course, the bridge deck, a column on which the bridge is resting, and abutments. Of course, there are the pile foundations below. Now, once we do nonlinear time history analysis of the bridge, using all the scenario earthquake ruptures that have already been obtained. Although I'm showing the response spectra here, I'm not doing, we're not doing this response spectrum analysis, which is a lot simpler. You just need to know the time period and then get what sort of spectral acceleration you have on the spectra. But what is done is a nonlinear time history analysis. So the earthquake time histories are subjected to all the free field nodes, and the entire bridge is made sure it vibrates. And only 2 components are considered here, only the horizontals, although you have even the vertical component that is available. And when we subject this bridge to the 2 components, we don't know a priori what is the orientation of the bridge. So the bridge is also rotated once, instead of considering all possible permutations and variations, only 2 such variations are shown, are considered. One is north-south and east-west orientation. Now, after considering and doing such nonlinear time history analysis, this sort of plot is rendered. It's called probabilistic seismic demand model, where each dot or circle here is due to one such nonlinear dynamic analysis. So once we do one such nonlinear dynamic analysis, and we have lots of different time histories of at different stations and also for different rupture scenarios, different locations of the hypercenter. So if all such dots are plotted on this sort of a plot where the x-axis is the intensity measure of that sort of time history, and y-axis is an engineering demand parameter, sometimes also known as damage measure, then a linear regression can be fit to all those dots, a straight line with also certain dispersion. As you can see, this dotted lines show the 1 sigma on either side compared to this mean line. And you can roughly write it as the y-axis is, anybody knows straight line equations, y is equal to mx plus c kind of thing. So some a plus b times the x-axis parameter, which is logarithm of intensity measure. Now, once we get one such regression curve, what can we say about it? If it doesn't have much of a slope, so the b value is very low, it's very flat. That means the engineering demand parameter is hardly varying with respect to the intensity. So such a PSDM is not much practical. But if at all it has higher slope, that sort of a thing is more practical, and that is more useful. So as intensity varies or increases, typically you would expect the bridge to respond more, be it we are considering column or abutment or deck. So the damage measure can be any of these parameters, the individual components of the bridge, or the overall response. Overall, you can do a system level, you can do component level. Some studies have shown that the column curvature ductility is most important parameter when it comes to these bridges out of all the subcomponents that are there. So that determines the system fragility more than the. But there may be cases with diaphragm abutment bridges, you may also want to consider even abutment response and see what's happening at the abutment. From the intensity measure point of view, x-axis, there are again lots of different intensities that are possible. Something that doesn't scale with the ground motion or magnitude is like a duration. You can talk about duration-based intensity measure. You can even plot x-axis to be your duration. So that sort of intensity measure can also be used. It's unscalable, but you can also use intensity measures like PGA, PGV, and so on. Those are ground motion scale-based measures. Then we also have compound intensities where you combine PGA, PGV, and multiply them with different powers or so on. They're called compound intensity measures. There can be also structure-related intensity measures. Structure-related intensity measure means you're bringing in the time period of the structure into it. So spectral acceleration, spectral velocity, all those things are structure-related intensity measure. So intensity measure choice is of utmost importance. One should be extremely careful. And there are some basic principles that most literature talk about that need to be satisfied by an intensity measure that you choose. And bare minimal versions of those are efficiency. What is efficiency? The dispersion has to be minimal. We talked about practicality. Practicality is to have higher slope. What about dispersion? Dispersion is this deviation that you're seeing from the best fit line to the 1 sigma. So that beta of engineering demand parameter conditioned on the intensity measure, that has to be as lower as possible. So that is an efficient intensity. Sufficiency. See, when we're talking about intensity, it can be even like your moment-Mercalli intensity if you're a seismologist. But when talking about intensity, we have eliminated magnitude, distance, everything here. So is it really sufficient? So if for a sufficient intensity measure, it should not have much dependency on these other things like magnitude, distance, and so on. That can be tested by using a p-value test in terms of statistical analysis. In addition to that, you also want such an intensity measure that has hazard compatibility. What does hazard compatibility mean? So whenever hazard is shown, you see it in terms of spectral acceleration, PGA, and so on. So that way, those are more hazard compatible intensity measures compared to others. So choice of intensity measure is very critical. You need to make sure you choose such an intensity measure that is critical to the structure that you're considering. And also in terms of demand damage measure, you want to be. This is a different style of going towards fragility compared to doing the incremental dynamic analysis, which is a lot more computational intensive when it comes to bridges that have lots of different components in them. So what the probabilistic seismic demand model is a linear regression that gives you damage for a given intensity. So the best fit line gives you the median of the demand curve. Now, the dispersion is also given here. But what is fragility? Fragility curve is again a representation of IM over DM, where it's a probability of damaged demand greater than capacity conditioned over intensity. So we are looking at the possibility of demand to be greater than capacity. We already know how the demand is going to be from this demand. You get the median from the best fit line, you have dispersion. So the demand distribution is already known. Capacity distribution has to be done from the test. One need to do the structural testing in a lab. You need to get as many different possibilities for the kind of typical sizes of the columns that are used for these bridges. So once somebody does collection of literature for lots of structural testing on columns that are typically used, one can fit a distribution to that, and that can be the capacity distribution. And we are interested in fragility, that is the probability of demand exceeding capacity conditioned on the intensity measure. So yeah, as I said, in this case, I'm broadly focusing on Southern California scenarios and Northern California scenarios. And in the Southern California scenarios, we have the Elysian Park, which is really close to Los Angeles. And as you can see on the x-axis, this intensity goes all the way up to minus 0.5. Of course, on the logarithmic scale, I'm doing in a log-log scale. There's a spectral acceleration 1 second. So the intensity measure of my choice turned out to be the spectral acceleration at 1 second. That's because the bridges that were considered, the Californian bridges, the scenarios are also from California, the bridges are also from California. And the bridge models for the kind of dimensions that have been chosen, their fundamental time period is close to 1 second. So it turned out, if you see Hazes recommends at least 3 different time periods, 0.3 second, 1 second, 3 second. So these structures are close to 1 second time period. So the intensity measure chosen is spectral acceleration in 1 second. And the damage measure chosen here is a column curvature ductility. Column has certain curvature, and that curvature is nonlinear in nature, and ductility, anybody who has studied basics of structural dynamics would know what ductility is. So this is not the displacement ductility, but the curvature ductility of the column. And that is done for the Elysian Park Hayward scenario, as well as the Southern San Andreas scenario. And broadly, each of these dots represent different nonlinear time history analysis at each of the stations. And the colors here represent different hypocenter locations. And the best fit lines are shown in red color. And also the dispersion 1 sigma is shown by the dotted lines. So there are, of course, only 2 scenarios in the Elysian Park, so you can see more clearly. In the Southern San Andreas case, there are lots of scenarios, and this is how it is for the Los Angeles case. And for San Francisco, I think the small misrepresentation here, San Jacinto should be here and Hayward should be here. So the Hayward fault in San Francisco, Northern San Andreas fault, they are representing the San Francisco region. And then the fragility curves were derived for the same intensity measure, and probability of demand exceeding capacity is shown on the y-axis. And for multiple evolution of the design philosophies of the bridges in California. So once upon a time, pre-1970s, the bridges used to be designed differently. There was no ductility per se. But beyond 1970s, ductility got incorporated into the design codes. And there was slight more change after 1990 in the design philosophy of the bridges. So those three have been modeled, three different eras of bridge have been modeled and subjected to two different orientations of excitation, two different orientations of the bridge, east, west, and north, south orientation. And the dots here are shown for San Francisco and even San Bernardino. As I said, there are also stations from San Bernardino Valley, and Los Angeles Basin is, of course, here. So x-axis now is the column curvature ductility. And based on the structural testing, these and I think the slight moderate extensive collapse, the damage states are represented here in different colors, where red is collapse damage stage, green is a slight, and intermediate colors representing moderate and extensive. So what you can see here is for San Francisco, Northern San Andreas region can induce certain collapse here. Similarly, San Jacinto ruptures are more dangerous to San Bernardino Valley rather than the San Andreas scenario, although Southern San Andreas can host up to 7.9 magnitude, remember. And when it comes to Los Angeles region, again, what we saw was the Elysian Park scenario, which is only 6.6 magnitude. It can excite close to collapse response of the bridges because it's so close. Its position is very close to Los Angeles compared to Southern San Andreas and Southern San Jacinto Fault, which can host up to 7.8 and 7.9 and 7.8 magnitude earthquakes. The 6.6 is actually making it collapse. So, of course, intensity is a combination of magnitude and distance. You can't just talk about magnitude without taking into consideration the distance parameter. The trend is mostly the same, irrespective of what era we were looking at. But yeah, as you go into very recent bridges, the recent bridges are more robust in the sense that they have column curvature ductility much higher. So it'll take at least, you can get a ductility factor much higher than 15, for instance, here for the more recent bridges in California. Now, if I have time, I want to also talk about this Cascadia subduction scenarios. So California is below here, but Cascadia is one such case in the US that has a potential to host 9 magnitude earthquake. So this is also quite important. And the scenario ruptures were motivated by USGS and University of Washington groups because Washington is, of course, sitting here. Seattle Basin is here. So the study is more oriented towards the basin studies for different hypocenter locations and different regions of low slip and strong motion asperities and so on. So the Cascadia subduction scenarios, as I said, were generated by the USGS in collaboration with the University of Washington. And they've used largely Tohoku rupture 2011 and also 2010 Chilean rupture. The slip models are mainly motivated by that. Remember, even the California scenarios, they're not just some random scenarios. They first validated the simulation methodology using the NGA-West relationships, and only after validation, new scenarios have been simulated. So the slip models are largely motivated by the Chilean and Tohoku earthquakes of 2010 and 2011. And a potential 9 magnitude earthquake has been simulated. Not one, again, as I said, there are multiple scenarios. So the multiple hypocenters are shown by this multiple aspects. So actually 30 scenarios were simulated. And later on for the sensitivity study, they are even done additional 20 more scenarios. So a good 50 scenario ruptures for the Cascadia subduction zone. Yeah, Cascadia subjection zone is also very rich in terms of tremors, slow slip, and whatnot. So the slip model, as I said, is a combination of the large patch that generates the low frequency content, but for engineers, what is more important is the strong ground motion generation asperities that are in close proximity. So the locations of the strong ground motion asperities is also varied. The down dip rupture limit has been varied, and multiple scenarios based on the logic tree framework have been simulated. You can look up Frankel et al. In BSSA or this one to understand. So we have taken all those time histories, and once again, what I'm showing here is the response spectra, and studied the bridges in Seattle Basin. Now, Basin typically gives you long period ground motion. Long period ground motion, the bridges that were considered here, their time periods were close to 1 second. So the long period bridges, if we want some resonance with the long period ground motion, we need tall or super tall bridges, and such bridges also exist. So 3 different kinds of bridge models were considered. Normal height, which is similar to what the bridge model I had already shown, and tall, super tall. The 30 scenarios have been shown here, along with the median and dispersion of the response spectrum. The bridge model this time is a seat abutment. The earlier one was a diaphragm abutment, where the bridge deck is in monolithic arrangement with the abutment. But now what you're seeing here is a seat abutment where and the individual components, their force displacement curves are shown here. I don't think we have enough time to go into the details, but this is a typical finite element model, the bare minimum that you can do. There are also other advanced models that one would want to look at if you're interested in grill age models and so on. Yeah, this is one such bridge that has been considered, but what we are varying here is the things like whether we have normal bridge or tall bridge or super tall bridge subjected to various scenarios with northern hypocenters or earthquakes that start somewhere in the central portion, or earthquakes that start much southern. So Washington is somewhere here, or Oregon, Portland, and Vancouver. So some researchers even in Canada are really interested in this 9 magnitude scenario of Cascadia subjection zone. That's because it has potential influence not only the US, but also parts of Canada. Vancouver, as you can see, is quite close by. So these are some of the results that we got. It's still unpublished work we communicated, but how the variation in hypocenter is going to change the bridge response depending on how tall it is. So if we still have some time, I just want to quickly talk about the directivity rupture scenarios. So these do not pertain to any region per se. These are hypothetical, again, scenarios that taking a simple box domain with a fault in the middle. But what is directivity? If this gray patch that you're seeing here is the top surface of the ground, and if this is the fault plane underneath, if the rupture propagates in one direction, that is the direction in which you see higher amplitude and lower rise time kind of pulses. In the backward directivity regime, you see broader pulses with lower amplitude compared to, say, a station that is oriented somewhere over here. So in particular, directivity influences the fault normal component of ground motion. Even if you remember in the bridges, I've talked about east-west and north-south, 2 different orientations. When we get closer to the rupture, we start talking about orientations that are oriented with the fault and perpendicular to the fault. So perpendicular to the fault is fault normal component, parallel to the fault is fault parallel component. So this is kind of domain tree here, typical of SCAC dynamic rupture benchmarks to show the top ground surface. 4 different asperities have been shown, and the same have been also marked here on the surface trace of, so this portion is the map view On the map view, the surface trace of the fault is shown in red, 4 different scenarios. The central portion is more bilateral rupture scenario. This is a highly unilateral rupture scenario, red in color. And stations are considered on 3 different racetracks at 3 different distances, 5, 10, and 15 kilometers away from the fault in the near field. And of course, this is more of a forward directivity station, S1, and also a station behind, that is a backward directivity station. We also have some fling step stations and some other stations at arbitrary orientations. So using such directivity ruptures, we also done the bridge modeling and bridge analysis in both fault parallel as well as fault normal orientations for various Q angles. So it's not always possible that one can construct a straight bridge. So lots of bridges are skewed. They make an angle with respect to the abutment. The longitudinal axis of the bridge has certain angle that is denoted by beta here, the skew angle. And this work is published in the Bulletin of Earthquake Engineering, where we analyze the extent of rupture directivity. So how far away is the nucleation from the center of the fault, the distance of the station, on which racetrack the station is, and the amount of the skew angle, skewness, how does that influence the collapse fragility of the bridges? And this has been studied for all these 3 variants, although I'm showing here only one thing, that is just with the skewness. So with the skewness, what's happening? So higher the skew angle, these are the fragility curves for various skew angles denoted by different colors. The trend is different whether you're looking at the fault normal orientation or the fault parallel orientation. So in the fault normal orientation, you can see that the 0 skew is over here, but it is somewhere over here when we're looking at the fault parallel orientation. So the trend is kind of reversed or flipped with respect to the skew angle, depending on whether we are looking at the fault parallel or fault normal orientation. And this is only shown for one particular distance. As I said, we have considered 3 different distances and multiple extents of depth with directivity also. For more interested, you can look up that reference shown here. There are also other ruptures called super shear, which travel faster than the shear wave speed. These are again generated based on the dynamic rupture principles. Even the directivity rupture that I've shown here, this is again a dynamic rupture that we have simulated. Unlike the kinematic ruptures for the Cascadia subduction zone and the California, these are dynamic ruptures scenarios. The subshear rupture, which travels at roughly 3 kilometers per second kind of thing. So it takes about 5 seconds to reach a 15 kilometer half length of the fault. But in this case, it does that in just about 2 to 3 seconds. So that travels at 5 kilometers per second. So knowing that the bedrock shear wave velocity is 3.6 kind of kilometer per second, you can easily say that this is already super shear. These are rupture time contours that you're seeing for 2 different scenarios on a fault plane that is shown in red here for a ground that's shown here. The fragilities for these, again, are very much dependent on the component or the orientation that you're looking at. A subshear rupture is a typical rupture that you typically see. So the red solid line and the red dotted line here, they are the fault normal and fault parallel components for the subshear. But the super shear ones are shown in blue here. So the overall trend, although is somewhat similar, but the median fragilities do change. That too drastically. It also depends on the time period of the structure that you're interested in, of course. And they're all largely component dependent, which orientation you're wanting to look at. We've also analyzed the focal mechanism influence. As I said, earthquake can be represented if you're looking at point source. It has strike, dip, rake, and also depth, of course. So fixing the depth, you are also going to have different kind of bridge response depending on what sort of focal mechanism that your earthquake has. And if a vertical strike slip fault, this is the classic example where you know the radiation pattern of the P waves is different from the radiation pattern of the S waves, which is why you, of course, are going to see different a kind of bridge response depending on which orientation you're looking at. So if an earthquake starts off somewhere over here, and if you're considering 4 different cardinal orientations along 4 different directions, because fragility, we need multiple stations. So the influence of dip angle is broadly shown here as you go to dips. So dip angle has been studied in increments of 15 degrees, 0 dip doesn't make much sense, but 15, 30, 45, 60, 90, and then vertical strike slip fall dip angle is shown for 4 different orientations here. Even the influence of the strike angle on the fragility of the bridge is shown here for various angles or orientations of the bridge. Strike variance again with increments of 30 degree this time, going from 0 to 330, noting that 360 degree is basically same as 0 degree. So we also tried to study the rake angle influence as well. We varied the rake angle. Rake angle ranges from -180 to +180, where -180 does correspond to same as +180. So we started off with -150 with increments of 50 degree and so on. So yeah, I don't have a summary slide, but what's shown here broadly are the bridges for various scenario ruptures, kinematic as well as dynamic. The kinematic ones are the more realistic ones from the perspective of California as well as Cascadia. From the dynamic rupture scenarios perspective, I've shown directivity ruptures which have a dominant fault normal component, whereas the super shear ruptures on the other hand have a dominant fault parallel component. And in addition to that, earthquakes are also represented by strike dip rake, the focal mechanism. So the bridge response due to different orientations of the bridge and different focal mechanism angles of the point source earthquake has also been shown in this talk. So with that, I think that's all I've got to show, and thank you. I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have.
If anyone is having any query, they can write it in the chat box. Sir, a question from Sachin. Sir, for real-time old bridge monitoring due to heavy vehicle movement on that bridge, is accelerometer data is sufficient or need other parameter also to monitor the response of the bridge? If need other parameter, then what are these parameters? And second question is how acceleration data is used for bridge damage study?
Yeah, good question. So yes, that comes under structural health monitoring. Yeah, we monitor the health of the bridges, how they're deteriorating as you keep multiple sensors, not one, of course, usually. But yeah, if the bridge is too old and the vehicle is too heavy, it may even collapse the bridge and your accelerometer may not record anything. So that's a flip side. So you need to know or assess even before letting such a heavy vehicle whether your bridge is really even capable of taking that sort of load or not. So yeah, the damage is quantified usually from free vibration analysis. So you're looking at largely the fundamental time period or the damping in the first mode, things like that, and how they would change as you start introducing cracks. This can be even, of course, studied from finite element analysis perspective also, without having to like directly go and test in real time, because you may even have this chance of making the bridge completely collapse. So yeah, you can put accelerometer, and that sort of data can also be used to study how the bridge is damaging, how the bridge fundamental frequency is changing with time, and you need to correlate that change in fundamental frequency with respect with damage. That's how you try to understand how it's getting damaged, because whenever you have cracks, that's the kind of damage that you're talking about, and that will deteriorate the structure's stiffness, and the fundamental frequency depends on both mass as well as the stiffness. In simple words, it's omega is root k over m. So yeah.
Thank you, sir. Now, if anyone else is having any question, please write it in the chat box.
I have a question, please.
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yes. Okay. My question first is this: that in case of a ground motion, and since you have done this all the capacity and all calculations, have you taken for the near field ground motion? Have you taken the pulse like the ground motion, because that's a main killer in the breed. So how I have not seen any presentation of your demand based on the ground motion type, if it is a pulse like ground motion, which is mostly observed in the Chi and all the earthquakes. So I was trying to understand how this is being done in the seismic design.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, the pulse-like ground motion, both directivity and super shear that I talked about, they have pulses in their ground motion. And the pulses have certain time period associated with it. And yes, if the structure's time period coincides with the pulse time period, that's going to, of course, cause resonance. So even in the focal mechanism study, we have considered a certain rise time for the pulse of that particular magnitude. So it was largely 7 magnitude, which is frequent enough, but also not large enough to simulate. So yes, there were pulses in the last part of what I've shown. And even in the Cascadia and California scenarios, there is a potential to see some pulses due to the basin resonance phenomena. As I said, basin study was done particularly from the point of view of understanding the long period pulse impact. So depending on the basin dimensions and the material that it has, the impedance contrast, it's going to elicit different kinds of pulses in it. And even the Nepal Kathmandu is a classic example. 2015, we have seen 4 to 5 second pulses. Yeah. So, yeah, well, there were pulses in the fragility analysis. We actually club all of them together. We have the pulses determine certain point on the fragility curve. And if they're eliciting larger response on the probabilistic seismic demand, they are probably going to be sometimes even an outlier also. So yeah, pulses.
So in the current,
in short, yes.
So
pulses.
in the current design code, do you already taken care of this type of pulses, or has it been improved in that sense or not, or
Yeah.
it is still under the research stage?
Yeah, design codes don't talk about this in more detail. They're largely talking about response spectrum analysis. And if anything, then they start saying you need to use time history analysis. Once it comes to time history analysis, that's when no one knows how many time histories to use, what sort of them to use, of them how many pulse-like to use, and so on. So some foreign codes do have some prescription. In fact, in my last ASSHEE talk, I've shown how many near-field pulses to be considered. And if we are doing, say 11 time history fragility analysis, how many such codal provisions are recommending. If it's the tall buildings, especially, they have some specialized codes, because tall buildings have these longer periods. So long period pulses would induce larger response in them. So they typically talk about 3 at least pulses when you're and all of this, of course, is dependent on how many ground motion data you're considering. If you're considering all of them to be pulses, what you end up doing is over-design. Over-design
Right.
is also not economical.
It's not also
So
right.
we need to hit a balance between the two. And design codes are for design, not for collapse prevention. That is also to be understood.
Right.
Design codes only say some 50% chance of collapse. So it doesn't say you're never collapsing, or so there is a possibility of collapse. It is up to the owner to decide to what level of hazard. And nowadays, the hazard thing is also formulated in terms of risk level. What the risk is something that the owners can understand more than the hazard. So I'm willing to take maybe 1% risk. So I think California is now greatly pushing towards this policy to the homeowners in terms of taking policy based on the risk level that they perceive rather than the hazard itself. So unless we do
now in this context, I was trying to understand how is the situation in India, or have we gone up to that level, or try to make the design for the new bridges into that level of understanding of the ground motions and all these things? Or are we taking care of this type of things in the new bridges?
Yeah, very
I
good.
know the old bridges, it is not a very possible, but the new bridges, whenever we are trying to design, are we keeping these things in our mind, particularly in the Himalaya and all these regions which are highly active zones.
Yeah, even for the old bridges, there is something called retrofitting. You need to make the bridges stronger or strengthen them. For the newer bridges, yeah, the codal provisions are slowly evolving one by one. Of course, recently the earthquake codes, they started to incorporate even the isolation mechanism, isolations and dampers kinds of things. So the codal provisions are evolving from the perspective of earthquake. They're trying to learn and understand. Of course, they are much faster nowadays. In olden days, the earthquake code got updated immediately after the Bhuj. The 2002 IIT 93, we had a 2002 version. That's because 2001 Bhuj earthquake has shaken up everybody, that the government's got really woken up. But then it cannot be just that sort of a short-lived thing. They've put up lots of sensors also. They've started the PESMOS initiative after that. But again, it was a forgotten thing. So unfortunately, during the 2015 Nepal earthquake, none of the PESMOS records have they have recorded anything. Now the PESMOS sensors. So this is another issue with the policymakers or the competent authorities, that their vision is kind of short-term in terms of funding these activities, because earthquake occurs so rarely and it causes so much damage. There's a lot of and you see a lot of initiatives suddenly appearing, but then once it's done, the funding would slow down. The things would be like, oh, there's still time, kind of thing. So yeah, things are evolving even from the perspective of bridge codes as well. It's taking time, but forming the codal committee provisions, including the practitioner engineers as well as the academicians and so on, it does take time. So from the perspective of isolation, and things have improved, but from this also, we hope to see more improvement with time.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Another question. What is pulsing area percentage of source and its motion simulation?
Yeah, I think pulsing area is something that people do in stochastic simulations that I haven't really talked about. What I'm talking about here are the kinematic rupture simulations or dynamic rupture simulations. In David Boo's SMSIM or XSIM, you see a lot of this pulsing area. Typically, they take it to be 50% or so with some margin. But yeah, this is not a parameter that is particularly taken care of in this. It's not necessarily needed, because the rupture tells you if it's dynamic. Once the earthquake is started at one point, the physics of the fracture mechanics and the contact friction law, they tell you how the rupture would propagate or evolve. So you don't have to prescribe all these things manually yourself, which means you're getting out what you really put in. So yeah, that parameter is not there. Yeah, one can do progressive collapse also. We've taken this fragility analysis, and we were looking more in terms of multiple scenarios, multiple bridges, and so on. Yeah, maybe for some other day, that sort of thing. There were two questions on progressive collapse. Yeah.
Yes, Professor Somala.
Thank you, sir.
It was a very educative and brilliant talk today.
Thank you.
I have a, as a layman seismologist, I have a little query that we have talked about the rupture propagation and also the, fault plane, strike, deep, and the rake of the faulting mechanism. Now, suppose in the Sumatra case, the rupture propagated along the strike, whereas in the Himalayan case, the rupture propagates in the deep direction, up deep direction. Means how do you reconcile this? Means my doubt is there how to handle such situation. Sometimes the rupture propagates along the strike, And in the Himalaya case, rupture propagates up deep direction. Say that is what is believed. Now, how you would consider these problems?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question, Mr. Kyle. Yes, in the dynamic rupture scenarios, when we perturb the stress, we can perturb it in the direction of strike or in the direction of depth. That will determine the direction in which the rupture would propagate. And as I said, in the case of Sumatra, these are all mostly strike current. They were propagating along the strike. So yeah, when we perturb the stress or prescribe the stresses, we do that in such a way that there is largely the along strike kind of stress, and along dip stress is set to 0 or some nominal value. Whereas when it comes to Himalayan generation of the scenarios, we would prescribe the along dip. We are doing a down dip rupture or up dip rupture. We can prescribe the stresses along the dip direction and make them go higher than the friction level at that point. And along the strike direction, you can have nominal value of stress or traction, shear traction. So that's how one would simulate such scenarios. And if we had enough bridges in that ocean of close to Sumatra, I would have done the scenario ruptures for Sumatra as well. But Himalaya is definitely of interest. We would like to start setting up such simulations in the near future, especially in the seismic gap regions where we tend to see getting the bridge model parameters is also of important. Such databases exist for California, Californian bridge parameters, the deck size or column width, and so on. But for Indian bridges, I couldn't find such a database either to do the bridge analysis or even to set up after setting up the rupture scenario. So this is work in progress, and we would like to really see this happening at the earliest possible.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you, sir. A question from Rashikesh Vandal. Sir, what can be the role of seismic analysis in progressive collapse of bridges?
Yeah, that progressive collapse is a topic for some other day. As I said, there are two questions on progressive collapse. One can do also progressive collapse if somebody is more interested in trying to push the bridge up to the collapse level, trying to do kind of your push-out analysis or trying to gradually increase the load up to a certain point. We didn't even do incremental dynamic. What we did is this individual nonlinear time history analysis and use the PSDM curves to extrapolate till the collapse point. So the PSDMs gives you, the probabilistic seismic demand model gives you the demand conditioned on intensity, the distribution of that. And that distribution has a median as well as dispersion, and both have been obtained from the PSDM model. And that can be extrapolated up to, once you know your capacity at which your bridge is going to collapse, you can even extrapolate that as well from the way that I have done. But yeah, this is a topic for some other day. Maybe next time we can take it up in more detail and get to understand.
Sir, a question from Sachin. Sir, what is the good book for understanding the bridge collapse analysis?
Yeah, I'm yet to find one. Maybe I'll start. A lot of structural dynamics books, they stop at the level of analyzing buildings and leave it there. You'll see some 2D versions of dams here and there. Largely, these encyclopedias have some chapters related to bridges here. But yeah, I'm yet to find a really good book that's very much dedicated to bridges. If you find one, yeah, definitely I'll let you know.
Sir, another question from Muhammad Fahad. Have we another technique to analyze progressive collapse of bridges?
Yeah, that's what I clarified. I combined both questions and answered in one. Both progressive collapse questions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for such an informative and interesting class. Now I request our session chair, Dr. Apu Kumar Shah sir to say something on concluding remarks.
And thank you very much, Somala sir. This is a very good presentation, and the question answer session, I think this is very informative and that will help the researchers. But what I find the question answer session and also your presentation, this will help the researcher who is already there in this field. So what is your suggestion for the young researchers to carry out research in this field?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you for your question. Yeah, this is a wide aspect. What was shown was end to end. We started off from earthquake rupture, going all the way to bridge collapse. Young researchers, of course, need to get the fundamentals right in terms of structural dynamics and the earthquake engineering kind of things. Start analyzing one structure at a time. Take it gradually. Learn this nonlinear time history analysis, because eventually that is what is all that you can do. And try to understand gradually, if somebody wants to switch into the earthquake side also, what are the different types of earthquakes, or what from the engineering seismology perspective, that they can learn a bit later slowly. Or if the audience are more from the engineering seismology perspective and they want to understand structural collapse, they would want to start off, again, doing this nonlinear time history for buildings, then the next level of structures, and so on, one at a time.
Okay, thank you, sir. And thank you all for such a nice session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for chairing the session. So, sir, we want to convey our small token of love from the students of Techno College of Engineering, Agartala, to our guest, Dr. Surendranath Somala, sir.
Oh my goodness.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
It's really beautiful.
Yes.
Okay,
Thank you, Professor Somala, for your wonderful lecture and wonderful teaching.
Thank you, sir.
Our student,
Thank
one
you,
student.
sir.
That's
And may I know who is the artist? May I know the name?
Sir, let it be confidential till validity session.
only validity session it will be disclosed.
Okay.
But it's wonderful.
Yeah. Just
Thank you,
Now,
Somala, sir. Thank you, sir.
thank you very much.
Now, I would like to request Dr. Apu Kumar Shah, sir, to grant me the permission for concluding today's session.
Yes, of course, please.
Thank you, sir. We will start our 8th technical session today at 7 p.m. So we will join with the same link by 6:45 p.m. for 8th technical session by Professor Anotrola Presson. Stay tuned and stay safe. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Professor Datta. Thank you, Professor Datta.
thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.